This evening, I'm beginning with a reflection on what we think sacrifice is. This is a chance for us to reflect on, something that we take for granted. We have, culturally, in the modern world, a concept of sacrifice. And it affects how we use that word, how we feel about things that are called sacrifices. So we're going to reflect on that. Then we're going to compare that to how ancient people, and specifically the ancient people of the Bible, viewed sacrifice and what it meant to them. We're going to find that there's a great contrast. Not to give too much away, but you will find that in the course of today's session. Then tomorrow morning we'll continue looking even more closely at the biblical concept and biblical meaning of sacrifice. And then in the last two sessions, we'll specifically shift to the Divine Liturgy and how the Divine Liturgy is a sacrifice and how we can, with our whole hearts, participate in the Divine Liturgy as a sacrifice. All right? By the way, before I go any further, I do appreciate questions. So as we're going, if you have a point that you want me to clarify or a question related to what we're talking about, feel free to get my attention, and I'll take questions as I'm talking, as well as at the end. All right? So, how do we think about sacrifice? I have sort of subdivided it into three different domains. And the first of those domains in which we use the word sacrifice is in terms of ritual offerings. Ritual offerings, and this would be, in our minds, typically the killing of an animal in the worship of a god. And this cartoon sort of depicts, I feel like, how we feel about those kind of rituals. Now, those rituals are common still in some parts of the world, but in America, we see them as pretty sinister, pretty grotesque, pretty strange and foreign, exotic, but not in an appealing way. Something that we would like to keep far from us. And so here we have a businessman. In his office, he's dressed in this sort of sinister and strange costume. He has a dagger in his hand. There's a poor goat here tied up underneath a grotesque idol with its tongue hanging out, And he presses the button on his phone, his intercom. He says, "Please hold my calls for the next 15 minutes, Miss Hamish." We see ritual offerings as something grotesque and sinister, and it's off-putting. Now, we might see depictions of it in movies. Now, think about Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which centers around this idea of sacrifice, and it's a very sort of gripping heart of the story, pun intended. But it's something that's fascinating, but can you imagine if that was happening next door to you? In fact, when some people came from the Caribbean, some immigrants from the Caribbean in a certain city in America decided that they wanted to practice their religion, which is sort of Afro-Caribbean traditional religion, in America, they wanted to sacrifice chickens, which was their custom. In that town, there was a whole big hoopla about it. It was in the papers. People were picketing them, complaining about them. The city council passed an ordinance that says you can't sacrifice chickens. Well, what happened to the First Amendment? That goes out of the door because of this idea of killing an animal in the worship of a god just feels gross and wrong to us. It feels inhumane. So a lot of negative feelings attached to ritual offerings. That's the first domain. The second domain, the other part of it is, I have another cartoon. The other part of it is, how do we think of a God who needs animals to be killed in his worship. That's something we struggle with, and this cartoon highlights that. It's a man in biblical dress approaching a goat with a dagger, and he says, "And the Lord said, I created the universe. What on earth makes you think I'll be impressed by a dead goat?" So not only is ritual sacrifice grotesque, it's also irrational from our perspective. And yet, we have to be honest, this man in the biblical dress, even though the setting and how he's approaching the goat has nothing to do with biblical sacrifice, biblical animals were sacrificed in the Bible, and God commanded it. So there's some tension here. Some tension between how we feel about the ritual, it's grotesque, it's irrational, and the fact that it is really at the center of biblical worship. Now, the second domain of sacrifice in the modern world is a metaphorical domain. So secular metaphors, specifically of sacrifice. And these are on a continuum. Sort of the ideal metaphorical sacrifice is what I call a noble renunciation. Noble renunciation. This is the sacrifice of a soldier who gives his life for his country. It's the sacrifice of parents who, give up sleep, money, career, hopes, dreams, whatever, for the sake of their children. It's the sacrifice of saints and martyrs and heroes for the sake of their God or their cause. Basically, it's giving something up, something of value, giving up something for the sake of a higher value, a higher good. And anyone recognize the still here? This is Spock's sacrifice when he says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one or the few. This is his sacrifice for the sake of his crew and of his friend and his friends. Okay. Now, on the other end of metaphorical sacrifices, when we use sacrifice as a metaphor, we have pernicious bargains. Pernicious bargains. And here, these two men are talking in the office, and one says to the other, "To get where I am, I had to make a lot of sacrifices. I sacrificed Jerry's health, Susan's marriage, and Henry's dignity." This is turning that noble renunciation on its head, right? And we can also talk about how, in a very negative light, maybe a man sacrificed his relationship with his family for the sake of his career. And that implies that he saw it as a higher good, but he was mistaken. And maybe he finds out later it's not a higher good. And so this idea of noble renunciation turned on its head. But again, sacrifice, whether in a positive or negative life, it has to do with giving something up. Giving something up, something of value. And then in the middle, there's actually a frame of meaningless losses, a zone of meaningless losses when it comes to sacrifice. And we see this especially in the use of certain terms in modern English. The word victim, when we hear victim, we instantly think someone who has suffered, especially someone who has suffered some violence, right? It might surprise you to know that the word victim in English comes from victima in Latin, which was a technical term for an animal offered in sacrifice. And it had nothing to do with suffering. The word itself in Latin had nothing to do with suffering. In fact, philologists have said that use of the word victim for an innocent sufferer of violence, as we say today, is something that didn't arise until a few hundred years ago. The word Holocaust, another group of sufferers, great sufferers of violence, comes from the Greek for a whole burnt offering. So this shows us how in our culture we are sucking every facet of sacrifice into this cloud of loss and suffering and violence. Now, the final domain is the theological domain, because sacrifice in Christian theology is just everywhere. So the sacrifice of Christ is at the heart of the gospel. The sacrifice of the divine liturgy, which we're going to talk about today, or the sacrifice of the Mass, as the Roman Catholics would say. But the Eucharist as sacrifice, that idea goes back to the beginnings. Actually, it goes back to the New Testament. And in the New Testament as well, all aspects of Christian life are described and explained in terms of sacrifice, whether it be worship or prayer or evangelism, believe it or not. St. Paul uses sacrificial metaphors to talk about evangelism, giving to the poor, giving in support of the ministry of the apostles. That's just what I can think of off the top of my head. But in this light, I was about to say in light of this cloud, but the cloud isn't light. In the shadow of this cloud, of loss and meaning and destruction and violence, how do people view the sacrifice of Christ on the cross? You know, we take it for granted, and we honor the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. But if you dropped, from another planet and someone came up to you and said, yes, Jesus was sacrificed for our sins, and you had the modern frame of reference, that's sort of like confusing. Like, sacrifice is irrational. Sacrifice is grotesque. Sacrifice is a really negative thing that I want to avoid if possible. Even the noble renunciations, the heroic soldier who sacrifices his life for his country, he would prefer not to be sacrificed if possible, right? The honorable thing is that he's willing, if it comes to that, he's willing to do that. But in our minds, sacrifice is something to be avoided. So what about sacrificial giving? When people say you should give sacrificially, does that make you feel good and happy and motivated? No, it makes you feel guilty. Guilty because it means that you need to suffer something, but it's a duty imposed upon you. Sacrificial obedience. That's another thing I didn't mention. Like St. Paul says, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Wow. Living sacrifice sounds worse than a dead sacrifice, because if you die as a sacrifice, then it's over. Living sacrifice, it's like vivisection. It keeps going on. The sacrifice of the Eucharist. So this is very confusing to us, this biblical and patristic language of sacrifice describing all facets of Christian life is really hard for us because of our modern idea of sacrifice. But good news, guys, the ancient people of the Bible and the church fathers didn't think of sacrifice that way. This is something new. When I say new, it's new from an Orthodox perspective. It's a few hundred years old. But it doesn't go back to the beginnings of our faith. How did ancient people feel about sacrifice? Well, here's some quotes from the Psalms. And now, behold, the Lord has lifted my head above my enemies. I went around and sacrificed in his tabernacle a sacrifice of shouting. I will sing and play the harp for the Lord. I will willingly sacrifice to you. Willingly. I will praise your name, O Lord, because it is good. Let them praise the Lord for his mercies and his wonderful works for the sons of men. And let them sacrifice to him a sacrifice of praise. And let them proclaim his works with great joy. Sacrifice with joy. If we're honest, can we, from our modern perspective, think about joy in sacrifice. But here they do in the scriptures. Now, the strangest reference in the Bible to sacrifice has to be from Proverbs. And this is in the context of the warning against the adulteress. So in Proverbs, there's actually, I think, several passages warning against the temptations of the adulteress. But in this one, Proverbs 7, it says, "Taking hold of him, her young man, she kisses him, and with shameless face she speaks to him. I have a sacrifice of peace. Today I am repaying my vows. For this reason I came out to meet you, desiring your face. I found you." This is sacrifice as a pickup line. I mean, absurd from our modern point of view. Sacrifice, as I said, is something that we want to avoid. And here she's using it to trick a young man to come into her bed. Now, this makes sense in the ancient world because sacrifices, as we're going to get to in a moment, were occasions for feasting. So the animals killed in sacrifice, oftentimes, much of their meat would be cooked and then used to serve a really festive meal to a group of people. So, and specifically, this sacrifice of peace was one of those types that ended in a feast. So what she's saying is, we're going to have a party. When she says, today I have a sacrifice of peace, it means we're going to have a party. Come, eat, drink, and be merry with me, and who knows what could come next. That's how it makes sense. It doesn't make sense from our point of view, but from the ancient point of view, in light of this feast, it does make sense. Here's another quote from Plato, now not from the Bible, but from ancient Greece, reflecting the same perspective. Here, Plato, the philosopher, the ancient Greek philosopher, says, "Naturally fear came upon me as I contemplated what one is to do for such a city as Athens, where young men and women are well fed, yet free from heavy and menial labors, which best quench willfulness, and where sacrifices, feasts, and dances are everyone's main concern throughout their lives. How in this city will they possibly abstain from the desires that too often cast many to the lowest depths, especially sexual desires? These young people are sacrificing too much." That's Plato's fear. Why? But again, because sacrifices were associated with feasts and dances. They were events of celebration. They were happy moments. They were joyful moments of fellowship, bringing people together in joy. So what was sacrifice for ancient people? First of all, in contrast to the modern world, where mainly we think of sacrifice in terms of those secular metaphors. That's how we usually use the word sacrifice. But in the ancient world, it was almost always a ritual. The focus of the idea of sacrifice was on those rituals described in the Bible and also described in other ancient cultures. These rituals involved offerings of meat, but not just animals for their meat, but wine, oil, and other foodstuffs. In ancient Greece and Rome, like basically any kind of food not only could be sacrificed, but had to be sacrificed, offered in sacrifice. Some portion of it had to be offered in sacrifice before it was consumed. In the Bible, there were some restrictions, which we'll talk about later, which were meaningful restrictions. But they were consistently, across the ancient world, offerings of meat, wine, oil, and other foodstuffs burned or poured out on an altar or displayed on a table in the presence of a god. So we're focusing on the burned and poured out sacrifices, which are the main sacrifices in the Old Testament. But there is, in the Old Testament a sacrifice involving the second sort of type, where foodstuffs were displayed on a table in the presence of a god. Can anyone tell me which sacrifice that is? Sorry? What? No, in the Old Testament. What's that? The showbread. Somebody said the showbread. The table of the showbread. In the tabernacle, there were 12 loaves that were set out, and they were changed on a regular basis, and they were displayed in the holy place before the tabernacle, which is where God's presence was. So that's the same idea as this display offering. These offerings of meat were often consumed in large part, by the worshipers. And they were occasions for feasting and central to all kinds of celebrations and holidays. So in ancient cultures, many of the things that we celebrate were celebrated through sacrifice. Weddings, birthdays, coming of age, all of these kind of things. Any questions so far? You guys are really quiet.
But the reason I named Baal was because I think of, well, first off, I'm coming off with Mendelssohn's Elijah. Baal we cry to thee, Baal we cry to thee. It was on Mount Carmel, and they were having a feast, and I believe Elijah came and stopped them. So how is that different? So what was your original question? So you were using it from a Jewish tradition rather than what was also happening at the same time?
No, all of those rituals were sort of in the same paradigm. So the sacrifices of Baal and Yahweh, the sacrifice that Elijah put out, were exactly the same. So they were animals that were slaughtered and then set out on wood on the stone altar that was constructed, but Elijah took a second step and he made the trench and he poured water on it. And then they tried to summon fire from heaven, and the priests of Baal, of course, were unsuccessful because Baal isn't able to do that. He's not really God. But Elijah proved not only that God was able to light that fire, but that he was able to burn up all the water as well. But the actual sacrifices were exactly the same in form. Yeah. And there is consistency. There's differences in details, but in this basic paradigm of sacrifice, it's the same across ancient cultures.
This is an ancient time. I was in an Indian temple 2 months ago.
Yeah.
In the main room, there were people like drinking hot soup.
Yeah. They still do these kind of things. Oh yes. Yeah, tradition, because Hinduism, of course, is very ancient religion, and they still maintain those. They still maintain those practices. Yeah, and actually, we still have some relics of this in the Orthodox Church. They're not necessarily called sacrifices, and even like paraliturgical customs. I learned from a Bulgarian friend of mine that when something good happens and people want to celebrate some blessing from God, they might like cook a fish and bring it to the church. And then the priest has some prayers, and then they divide up the fish to share amongst themselves.
St. Fenorius bread.
Yeah, St. Fenorius bread, koliva, artoklesia, we have a lot of feast days.
We used to have a tradition that whenever somebody had a feast day, they would bring something for
Treats.
everybody. We used to meet every day.
Share
Yeah.
congregation.
Something for everybody.
Yeah. And these sacrifices, contrary to our modern idea of sacrifice, were not essentially violent. And we can see this through many details of ancient sacrifice. One of them is that even though we focus on the animal sacrifice, there were many sacrifices that didn't involve animals, what I call vegetal sacrifices. These were offerings of grains, baked goods, oil, wine, and incense. And all of these offerings are described with the same terms, and they have the same basic procedures. They fit into the same category as the animal sacrifices. So even though we focus on animal sacrifices, and because of the killing of the animal, that's really what we focus on, that's not really central to the ancient practice of sacrifice because of these many vegetal sacrifices. And even in animal sacrifices, that killing of the animal was actually not the focus. It was one of the preliminary steps. But if you look, one of the best examples is if you look on ancient Greek depictions of sacrifice, especially on ancient Greek pottery, it hardly ever shows the killing of the animal. It shows other parts of the ritual which were actually more like paradigmatic, more symbolic of the ritual. Like those were the focus of the ritual, those other events. So like the shared feast afterwards, or the procession where the animal was being sort of ceremonially led to the sacrifice. For Greeks, ancient Greeks, those were the focus. In biblical sacrifice, as we'll see when we go through the ritual steps, the focus was on the parts that were done by the priest. So obviously, if there are certain parts that are done by the layperson, and then later the priest comes in and does other parts, the priest parts are the more important part, right? I mean, we would just sort of naturally understand that the priests are the experts. And so the experts come in to do the most important parts. In the ancient biblical sacrifices, the parts that the priest had to do were the placing of the meat on the altar, and the splashing of the blood around the altar. We'll talk about those steps, but basically the placing of the meat and the blood onto the altar, those were the focus of the ritual, not the killing of the animal, which could be done by a layperson. And actually there's very little description of how it's done, whereas for those more important steps, there's like really lengthy descriptions of how you have to do it. But in terms of the killing of the animal, it says, just kill the animal, and then do this, and then do this. It's not the focus, like it is in our minds. You know, we think of sacrifice, animal sacrifice, as bringing an animal, putting it alive on the altar, and then cutting its throat, and that's like the moment. Its throat was cut before it got to the altar. And a lot of things had to be done to the animal before it could reach that place. And we're going to go into more detail on that tomorrow. And then finally, the animal's killing, which was not the focus of the ritual, was also not an act of violence, but simply a practicality. A modern historian who's not writing from a theological perspective, he's writing just to try to explain this ancient phenomenon of sacrifice. He said, how are we supposed to understand the killing of the animal as part of a sacrifice? He explained it and said, anyone who's tried to eat raw and live and animal will understand why it needs to be killed. You know, this is meat production. And one of the reasons why animal slaughter and sacrifice is so uncomfortable for us is that we're also distant from meat production. We're used to going to a supermarket and there are cuts of meat there. But you know, in order for those cuts of meat to get there, somebody has to kill an animal and drain its blood and cut it and take its skin off and cut it into pieces. And that's exactly what's happening in this ritual. But understanding it as a practicality, again, it's the way to expose the meat to make the meat available as an offering. So, in light of this contrast, I'd like to say to you about this word sacrifice. You keep using this word. I do not think it means what you think it means. All right, that's all I have for tonight. So we have some time for questions.
It's tragic, but where did the whole idea in pagan come with child sacrifice? Where did that
Yeah.
show up?
So that is a huge distortion. So when I said that that there's commonalities, there are commonalities in terms of like the basic paradigm, but then you find in paganism like really weird distortions. I mean, that's one of the weirdest ones. I would, if I were to speculate, where does that come from? It comes from a very distorted idea of God, right? To think that God would be pleased with that kind of meal. Very, very strange. And also maybe from a sense of desperation. Something I didn't mention, we focus in modern times in terms of ritual sacrifice, we focus on animal sacrifice, but we actually also focus on human sacrifice. If you Google the word sacrifice, there will be a lot of references to human sacrifice that come up at the top. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Because it captures our imagination. Historians say that it was exceedingly rare in the ancient world. And often it was explained by very desperate circumstances. When people came to a point where they just like didn't know what to do, they didn't have a frame of reference, so they're like, maybe we can get God's attention by, killing our child, for him or something like that. So it is obviously warped, but maybe it came out of that sense of desperation and a mistaken theology, a mistaken idea of God.
So that would show that other sacrifices don't necessarily need to be acts of desperation, or that would be an improper view or an improper motivation for a sacrifice would be desperation. Would that be correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely from the Christian point of view and from the, biblical point of view, even in the Old Testament, sacrifice has to be based on faith, right? Desperation is not faith. Thank you. Desperation is not faith, and as the scriptures say, anything that doesn't come from faith is sin.
I want to ask, it's my understanding, I'm piggybacking off of what Joe just asked, but in some sense, isn't that maybe through a few steps where we get the idea of even penal substitutionary atonement? Because Vikings were, the story, I mean, from what I understand, is Edson with Cairnberry was trying to evangelize people who actually did engage in human sacrifice, and one of the, at least a theory I've heard, is that was how that effectively penal substitutionary atonement was how he described Christ's sacrifice to them in order that they would understand it. And that may be a simplification. I'm curious.
I haven't studied that. I mean, it's possible. The route that I've sort of seen described is that, as I talk about in my book, that, animal sacrifice was done away with in the Christian world by the triumph of Christianity. And so these ancient practices, which everyone were familiar with because they engaged in them every day, were no longer available, and they no longer had an intuitive grasp of what these rituals meant, or even the word meant when they saw it in texts. And so when Western Christians returned to this term of sacrifice in a serious way, at the time of the Reformation, because of debates about the sacrifice of the Mass, Protestants said it's not a sacrifice, that the Eucharist is not a sacrifice. Catholics said it was, that they had to define their terms. And so they defined it based on the sacrifice of the cross, but based on their understanding of the cross.
Per modern legal theory, that kind of...
because of the Western focus on violence.
Oh, okay.
So sacrifice became defined by violence because it was defined by the Western understanding of the cross, which was focused on violence, whereas the Eastern understanding has not had that focus on violence. So, but I mean, it's an open field for understanding where it came from. I think it's easy to say that it's not consistent with the Bible, but to say like how we got there, it's distorted. But it might be the same kind of impulse that led to child sacrifice, that that leads to thinking that God could be pleased by the killing of someone. Yes?
What role does like demonic influence, or how does the church look at demonic influence for like in relation to child sacrifice? Would that be?
Oh yeah, well, so the fathers say that the pagan gods were demons, who fooled mankind into following them rather than following the true God. And so we're not going to have a chance to look into it. It's in my book, but sacrifice, according to the Bible, it goes back to the very beginning of mankind, to Cain and Abel. And the first or the second generation, the firstborn generation of humankind, they offered a sacrifice just as if it was natural. And the church fathers explained, because God has planted in us this desire to make offerings to Him that's fulfilled through sacrifice. But the problem is, of course, human sin came in, obviously with Cain. And before he sinned by killing his brother Abel, he sinned by making an improper offering. And so as sin came in and distorted not just human life in general, but religious practice specifically, that's where these things like these distortions like child sacrifice and also less sort of sinister distortions, but still very pernicious, very harmful. The use of sacrifice in order to bargain with God, like this way of manipulating God, like, oh, if I offer Him this, then He'll have to, He'll make me win the lottery if I if I kill a cow for Him or something like that, kind of as a barter arrangement. But yeah, all those distortions came in and sort of spiraled out of control until God came in and told Moses, okay, this is the right way to sacrifice. This is the way that's truly meaningful, that pleases me. And so we find in Leviticus very detailed instructions on how to sacrifice. And these, for us, represent like a purification of this really intrinsically human impulse to sacrifice.
Do you want to address the issue of like abortion? I hear many people have made the comparison between the worship of Moloch and the way we have customarily treated abortion as a sacrifice and some sort of pagan, selfish, demonic inspired. I mean, it seems a little too close to not be of the same ilk and spirit, but I don't know that anybody thinks about it popularly in that regard other than some evangelical circles. So
I would be a little hesitant to describe it in that language. I mean, I would say that there's an interface, right? Because of the heartlessness. So if you're willing to kill your child, whether it be in worship of a god or, in service of your own selfishness, that heartlessness, that cruelty, is the same kind of cruelty. But I think that use of sacrificial language about abortion really comes from the modern distorted view of sacrifice as killing. So I would say, yeah, there's an interface there, but I wouldn't call it sacrifice. Yeah. Do not think it means what you think it means.
I think I asked Father Thomas when he went through your book if he'd seen Babette's Feast. Have you seen the movie Babette's Feast?
I've heard about it, but I have not seen it.
It's magnificent. That's all whenever you get a chance to, it's worth long reflection.
All right, any last questions? Okay.
Maybe a comment. I just noticing that it seems kind of Interesting that we're appalled by the idea of human sacrifice, but yet the crucifix is right there.
Excellent.
Well, and yeah, that's the difficulty people have though with Christianity. Yeah, that's the question. That's what I was getting at with my question, is that we take it for granted if we've come to the church, through being born into the faith, being born into Christian faith at least, or for other reasons, other things brought us into the church because of other facets of teaching. But I think the idea of sacrifice, the sacrifice of the cross, is not what brings most people into Christian faith, because we can't understand it, we can't comprehend it. And there's a lot of difference between this cross and human sacrifice, as either child sacrifice or Aztec sacrifice or the Temple of Doom or what have you.
Well, I mean, I'll make one other comment. I've been very slowly reading through the Iliad with Eleanor, which may be a mistake, but it's a little mature. It's more mature than I realized.
Is she reading it to you?
No, I'm reading it to her so I can edit things on the fly. But actually reading Father Jeremy's book has actually been helpful just for me to kind of think about the way ancient people are talking. So this is 900 BC, roughly, and if you've never read the Iliad, spoiler alert, everybody dies. And the killings are in just great detail, but they're never, and sometimes they're even considered noble, but they're never described as sacrifice. And yet sacrifices happen all throughout the book. They are constantly making sacrifices over and over again. And it's always a joyful thing. It's always it's sacrifices because they're thankful. Sacrifices because they're going into battle. Sacrifices because they've come out of battle. It's always something to come back to relate to, their God of the Greek pantheon of choice. Yeah.
Yeah, this idea of a soldier's sacrifice is completely foreign to ancient literature. It's not found. The only places where in ancient Greek literature, there's some kind of connection between sacrifice and human sort of self-offering is in some of the tragedies, but that's a little bit like some of the Greek tragedies, but that's also a little bit questionable, like matter of interpretation. But Iphigenia, who is sacrificed to save her city or something like that. In some versions, she's not killed. Anyway, getting a little in the weeds. But just to say that almost 100% it's not there. And in those cases where it emerges in tragedies, it's for a literary dramatic purpose. Because tragedies are they're meant to have shock value, to make people rethink how they're looking at things. And so these are not normal situations that are being presented, as with comedies, which sort of make lighthearted looks at everyday life. But in tragedies, it's sort of like turning typical things on their heads. So that's where you see violent sacrifices, is in the tragedies, and it's to make it's for dramatic purposes.
Would you please remind me why Cain's sacrifice was unacceptable? Because, sure, it's not because it was not acceptable.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Sure, so, and this is covered in the book as well, but, so that is a common mistaken explanation for why Cain's offering was not acceptable. In fact, in another version of my retreat talks where I focus on atonement, I have another cartoon where there's a picture of Cain. He's standing next to an altar, and he says, God, I brought my offering again. Brought my offering of vegetables again, but now it's cleverly shaped like an animal. So he has like an animal made out of carrots and radishes and things like that. And so, of course, it's based on this idea that only animal sacrifices are acceptable, which is rubbish if you've actually read the Bible. So why wasn't it acceptable? Well, St. John Chrysostom, St. Ambrose, St. Cyril of Alexandria, all explain it the same way, which is that they focus on how Abel's offering is described as being from the firstborn and from the fat animals, from the finest animals. That Abel gave his best, but then when it comes to Cain, it said, and he made an offering of the fruit of the earth. It doesn't specify that he gave the best to God. So they point out that Abel was focused, he prioritized giving the best to God, but Cain was like, oh, well, I've got, some potatoes over here, I don't really need them, and, here's a melon, I've got plenty of those. Sort of like he was looking out for number one himself first. He wanted to save the choicest things for himself and then go through the motions. I'm supposed to make an offering to God, but what does he care? This potato's going a little rotten, but it's just going to be burnt up, like what does God know? And then when you look in the Septuagint, it's actually clearer than in the Hebrew. In the Septuagint, God says to Cain, why are you morose and why is your face downcast? If you offer correctly, but do not apportion correctly, do you not sin? So God was saying Cain was correct to make an offering. That part was right, but what he got wrong was apportioning. He didn't assign the best part to God. He didn't divide what he had properly, which is to give the best to God and keep the second best for himself. Which explains, like in those offerings where most of the animal is returned to the people, what's burnt on the altar is the suet, which is for sheep and cattle, it's the same as lard in pigs. It's the richest, densest fat. And according to the law, Jews were not permitted to eat that because all of that was reserved to God, the best part. And in fact, people actually do eat the suet in other cultures, in non-Jewish cultures, and it's considered a delicacy. I mean, it's British cuisine has some of that. But it's the idea of prioritizing God and showing him that he's most important because you give him the best. And you make that effort of giving him the best.
So ultimately, what happened to that suet? Did the priest consume it, or?
No, it's burned on the altar.
It's just burned on the altar, okay.
Burned on the altar. Unless they, so they were allowed to they were allowed to butcher animals non-sacrificially, which was very strange in the ancient world, but because there was only one temple, if they lived far away from it, then they could butcher an animal non-sacrificially in order to have dinner, at their table. The idea being, if you're in Jerusalem, that everything you eat should be offered as sacrificed and then taken back to the table. But when they offered non-sacrificially, they still couldn't eat the suet. They had to bury it. And the blood as well, they had to bury. They couldn't consume any blood because the blood was also for sacrificial ritual purposes.
So all of their meats were offered for sacrifice?
Idealistically, but so originally when the people of Israel left Egypt, they were traveling in sort of like a caravan, right? So they were all together. And the rule was that everything that they ate, if it was an animal proper for sacrifice, had to be offered as a sacrifice first, and then they would be given back the meat after the ritual. But when they settled the land of the Promised Land, there was only one temple in Jerusalem. So if you lived far away from that, Moses said you don't have to, walk for a day's journey every time you want meat, but you can butcher away from the temple, but you still have to, those sacrificially significant portions, the suet and the blood, that couldn't be eaten by people. They had to be buried in the ground.
So the sons of Eli they got in trouble with God for reaching in and, I always wonder, what's the context of that? Like, imagining this pot or whatever, and it's supposed to all go to God, and they're just reaching in with their pokers and grabbing. I'm not sure how that.
I have to reread that, but no, what was in the pot was the leftover parts after the best parts were burned on the altar. So that what was in the pot was for people to eat. But I think it was, so when an offering was made, the best parts went to God, certain other parts went to the priest, and the rest was for the worshipers. So it's possible that the people, like the priests, the sons of Eli, were not being content with the designated parts for them, but they were taking some of the parts that belonged to the people. I don't know. We'd have to look at it more closely.
The priest was a vegetarian.
He's out of luck.
He has to quit.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, because it's part of his work specifically to eat the sin offerings. Sin offerings, when they were brought by the people, weren't returned to the people. Like the best parts were burned, and because you couldn't celebrate your sin, yay, I sinned and I'm having a party and eating all this good food, No, but the remainder of the food was given to the priest to eat. And there was an occasion when Aaron and his sons didn't eat the meat, and Moses came and he rebuked them. He said, it's been given to you to eat in order to absolve the sins of the people. And so it was ritually significant, their eating the meat. It wasn't just to dispose of it, but it had meaning. And Philo of Alexandria explains that and says that when the priests eat the remnants of the sin offering, they show that God accepted the sin offering, and that he therefore accepted the sinner. Because imagine someone did something terrible to you and you set out a feast for them, and then they say I'm not going to eat at your table, because that means they don't forgive you, right? But if they agree and they sit down to eat at your table and to accept your hospitality, it means that they're accepting you. So the priests, as God's representatives, when they ate the food, it showed that God was accepting the people and forgiving them. Okay.